When you imagine medieval Spain, your thoughts may turn first to castles on dry plains, to knights of Castile and Aragon, or perhaps to the grandeur of Granada's Alhambra. Yet long before those kingdoms rose, there was another, small, remote, and stubborn. This was the kingdom of Asturias, born in the mountains of northern Spain in the 8th century. Too many. It is almost forgotten. But it was here that Christian resistance against the Moors began. In a kingdom that was less a realm of riches than a refuge of survival, Asturias lay in a rugged land. High mountains, deep valleys, and a damp Atlantic climate made it very different from the sun-baked plains of central Spain. Forests covered the slopes, streams cut through meadows, and mist lingered on ridges. For outsiders, it was difficult to conquer. For those who lived there, it was difficult to leave. Geography gave Asturias both hardship and protection. The story begins with the Muslim conquest of Iberia in 711 CE. Within a few years, most of the peninsula fell under the rule of the Umayyads, who established Al-Andalus. Yet the mountains of Asturias were too remote, too poor, and too fiercely defended to be fully subdued. Local chieftains, Visigothic nobles fleeing southward defeat, and farmers clinging to their valleys gathered here. Out of this refuge emerged a leader, Pelagius. Pelagio was likely a noble of Visigothic origin, though the details of his life are blurred by legend. In 722, he rallied a small band of men in the mountains near Covadonga. According to later chronicles, he and his followers defeated a Muslim force there, in what became celebrated as the Battle of Covadonga. Whether the battle was large or small is debated, but its memory became symbolic. The moment when Christian resistance began. From this foothold, the kingdom of Asturias was born. Daily life in early Asturias was not grand. Kings ruled from simple halls rather than great palaces. Peasants farmed small plots, growing barley, wheat, and rye in narrow valleys. Cattle and sheep grazed in high pastures, their bells clinking softly. Villages were clusters of wooden houses with thatched roofs, smoke curling from hearths. The diet was plain: bread, cheese, stews of beans and cabbage. Life revolved around farming seasons, the rhythm of rain and sun, the stubborn work of survival, and a rugged land. What gave Asturias strength was not wealth but terrain. The mountains made large armies difficult to move, and the narrow passes allowed small forces to resist larger ones. Local knowledge mattered more than numbers. Shepherds could guide fighters through hidden paths. Farmers could shelter fugitives in villages. The kingdom's survival was not built on grand victories but on constant endurance. Kings of Asturias styled themselves heirs of the Visigoths, the rulers who had lost Spain to the Moors. This claim was more symbolic than real, but it gave them legitimacy. They saw themselves not just as mountain lords, but as the keepers of a broken crown. Their courts, though small, maintained scribes, priests, and chroniclers. Monasteries were founded in valleys, where monks copied texts, preserved learning, and prayed for the survival of their kingdom. Religion was central. Churches in Asturias were built in a distinctive style, simple yet strong, using local stone. The most famous is Santa Maria del Naranco, originally built as a royal hall before becoming a church. Its arches and barrel vaults foreshadow Romanesque forms centuries later. Within such churches, priests celebrated mass, peasants offered tithes of grain, and kings were buried. Faith gave the kingdom identity. In a peninsula now largely Islamic, Asturias declared itself Christian. Yet survival was never easy. Muslim governors in Al-Andalus launched raids into the north, sometimes devastating villages, sometimes forcing tribute. Asturian kings paid when they had to, resisted when they could. Alliances were fragile, power often local. Royal authority extended only as far as mountains allowed. Beyond them, villages lived by their own rhythms. The court was small, the army smaller. It was less a kingdom of wealth than a confederation of valleys bound by necessity. And yet, from the small, damp corner of Iberia, a long process began. The Reconquista, the slow Christian reconquest of Spain that would last centuries. Later kingdoms of Leon, Castile, and Aragon would rise from Asturias' legacy. But in these early centuries, that future was uncertain. To live in Asturias was not to imagine conquering Spain, but simply to survive one more winter, one more raid, one more generation in the shadow of mountains. Standing in Asturias today, among green hills and stone churches, it is hard to imagine that this modest place once carried the hopes of resistance for all Christian Iberia. Yet it did, quietly, stubbornly. Its legacy is not in riches or monuments, but in endurance. And so we pause with a question. How much of history is built not by great empires, but by small, forgotten kingdoms that endured simply because they refused to disappear? If the kingdom of Asturias began as little more than a desperate refuge, it slowly learned to think of itself as something more enduring. The Battle of Covadonga, whatever its true scale, gave later Asturians a legend to anchor their sense of destiny. From that small beginning, the kingdom expanded cautiously, testing its strength against geography, neighbors, and the constant presence of Al-Andalus to the south. Under Paleo's successors, Asturias moved from mere survival toward cautious growth. Kings such as Alfonso I, 739 to 757, extended the kingdom's reach westward into Galicia and eastward toward Leon. Much of this expansion was less conquest than resettlement. Muslim forces, focused on richer lands to the south, often left northern territories thinly controlled. Asturian rulers moved families into abandoned villages, a process known later as repopulation. It was a slow reclamation of valleys, fields, and forests, one farmstead at a time. Life in these resettled lands was harsh but communal. Families built wooden houses with stone foundations, clustered near streams or springs. Fields were cleared of brush. Oxen dragged wooden plows through rocky soil, and harvests were stored in granaries raised on stone pillars to keep rodents away. People relied on barley, rye, and oats, supplemented with beans, cabbages, and fruit from orchards. Herding remained vital. Sheep for wool, goats for milk, and cattle for plowing. The rhythm of survival demanded endless repetition, planting, weeding, harvesting, and storing. A bad year could mean hunger. A good year meant only enough to endure the next. Yet Asturias also fostered a spiritual identity. Kings patronized monasteries, granting them land and privileges. These monasteries became centers of both faith and survival. Monks prayed the hours, copied manuscripts, and taught children to read. They also farmed fields, bred animals, and brewed ale. Their cloisters echoed with chanting, but their barns echoed with the thud of grain sacks and the clink of milk pails. In a time when war and famine were constant threats, monasteries provided not only religion, but also stability. The art and architecture of Asturias reflect its dual nature, modest in scale, yet ambitious in design. Early Asturian churches, such as San Julian de los Prados in Oviedo, used local stone, but borrowed forms from Visigothic and even Roman traditions. Frescoes adorned walls, depicting biblical scenes in muted colors. Windows let in soft light, and barrel vaults gave spaces a solemn gravity. These churches were not massive cathedrals, but they carried a sense of dignity, showing that even in remote mountains, culture and faith endured. At the royal court, small though it was, kings balanced war, tribute, and diplomacy. Some years, Asturian rulers raided into Muslim territory, seizing livestock or goods before retreating into the safety of mountains. Other years, they paid tribute to avoid devastation. Chroniclers recorded victories, but the reality was a cycle of survival, negotiation, and occasional defiance. Kings ruled more like warlords of valleys than emperors. Yet over generations they established a continuity that gave the kingdom legitimacy. For ordinary villagers, politics mattered little compared to daily burdens. Taxes were collected in kind grain, wool, or animals delivered to royal agents or monasteries. Lords offered protection in exchange for labor. Men served in militias when summoned. Carrying spears and wooden shields, women managed households, tended gardens, and spun wool into thread. Children herded animals or helped in fields. Their world was small, bounded by hills, streams, and the sound of church bells marking time. Still, life was not without moments of color. Religious festivals punctuated the year. Easter, Christmas, and saints' days brought processions, feasts, and music. Villagers shared roasted meat, drank ale, and danced in circles. Weddings were community affairs, with songs, gifts of bread and cheese, and blessings from priests. Even funerals, somber though they were, connected families to ancestors buried in churchyards. These rituals gave meaning to lives otherwise dominated by toil. The kingdom also became a refuge for Christians from the south. As Muslim rule stabilized in Al-Andalus, some families sought safety in the north, bringing with them skills, traditions, and stories. These migrants enriched Asturian culture, blending Visigothic, Roman, and local practices. In a way, Asturias was less a continuation of the Visigothic kingdom than a patchwork of survivors, stitched together by necessity and faith. Of Oviedo, founded by King Frula I in the 8th century and developed by Alfonso II in the 9th, became the symbolic heart of Asturias, a small city compared to later capitals. It held royal palaces, churches, and administrative buildings. Pilgrims came here to venerate relics, and over time, Oviedo became a stop on routes leading toward Santiago de Compostela. Though modest, it gave the kingdom a center, a place where scribes kept chronicles, kings held councils, and bishops guided faith. By the 9th century, Asturias saw itself as more than a mountain refuge. Under Alfonso II or 791 to 842, the kingdom styled itself openly as the heir of the Visigoths. Alfonso even established diplomatic ties with Charlemagne's empire to the north. Seeking recognition of his rule, he rebuilt Oviedo with palaces and churches, strengthening the image of Asturias as a Christian stronghold. His reign also coincided with the discovery of the tomb of St. James at Compostela, which would later turn Galicia into one of Europe's greatest pilgrimage centers. Whether by chance or design, Asturias gained spiritual weight that far outweighed its size, and yet, for all these developments, the kingdom's reality remained fragile. Muslim armies launched raids northward, sometimes reaching deep into Asturian lands. Villages were burned, fields seized, and livestock stolen. Recovery was slow, and each generation faced the same cycle of fear, loss, and rebuilding. Asturian kings could claim victories, but the balance of power was always precarious. Survival required patience, endurance, and constant adaptation. The people of Asturias lived with this tension daily. A farmer plowing his field knew raiders might appear. A monk copying scripture knew the manuscript could one day be lost in fire. A child growing up in a village might see the same valley raided, abandoned, and resettled multiple times. History here was not linear triumph, but a rhythm of survival. What makes Asturias remarkable is not its wealth or power, but its persistence. It endured long enough for other kingdoms lean, hostile, and arrogant to emerge from its legacy. Without Asturias, the idea of Christian resistance in Spain might have been extinguished. Yet for those who lived there, this destiny was invisible. They were not building Spain, they were surviving Asturias. And so we pause with a question. When a small, fragile kingdom endures through centuries of hardship, is its greatness found in victories or in the quiet resilience of people who simply refuse to vanish? By the 9th and 10th centuries, the kingdom of Asturias had grown beyond its humble beginnings. What started as a mountain refuge after the Battle of Covadonga had expanded into a small but enduring state. Its kings now ruled not only the valleys of Asturias, but also Galicia and Leon. The story of Asturias was no longer only about hiding in the mountains. It was about building a new foundation for Christian rule in Iberia. The turning point came under Alfonso II. The chase 791 to 842, his reign brought stability, order, and vision. He made Oviedo the capital, building palaces, churches, and administrative halls. Frescoes adorned chapels, chronicles recorded events, and royal councils planned campaigns. He also linked Asturias to wider Europe, corresponding with Charlemagne's court and aligning himself with Christian powers to the north. Under Alfonso, Asturias began to see itself not as a marginal kingdom, but as the legitimate heir of the Visigothic crown. Perhaps most important was the discovery of the supposed tomb of St. James the Apostle in Galicia. Pilgrims soon began to travel to Compostela, and the shrine became a powerful spiritual magnet. Although Santiago de Compostela's fame would grow much later, its discovery in the Asturian era gave the kingdom immense symbolic weight. Asturias was no longer only surviving, it was providing Europe with a holy site that rivaled Rome and Jerusalem. The kingdom's expansion southward was cautious. Kings launched raids across the Douro River, testing Muslim defenses, then retreated back to mountain safety. Slowly, lands north of the Douro were resettled. Farmers built new villages. Monasteries cleared forests, and churches rose in frontier zones. The process was uneven. Raids and counter-raids could erase years of progress, but it laid the groundwork for future kingdoms. Asturias, small and poor though it was, had become the seed of the long Reconquista. Life for the people of Asturias, however, remained much as it had been. Villages still depended on subsistence farming, herding, and small markets. Roads were few, travel slow, and literacy rare outside monasteries. Royal decrees had little effect beyond major valleys. Local lords and abbots carried real authority. For peasants, allegiance to a king in Oviedo or Lean meant little compared to loyalty to a lord who provided protection and access to land. Their world was bounded by hills, streams, and seasons. Even as kings spoke of crowns and crusades, by the 10th century, the kingdom had grown enough to seek a new center. King Garcia I 910 to 914 moved the capital southward from Oviedo to Lean, closer to the frontier with Al-Andalus. This shift marked the symbolic end of Asturias as an independent identity. The kingdom of Lean became the new heart of Christian Iberia. Stronger and more expansive, Asturias was absorbed into this new crown, remembered as the starting point, but no longer the center. The transition did not erase Asturias' legacy. Its churches remained. Its monasteries continued to function, and its chronicles preserved the memory of Paleo and Covadonga. Yet Asturias itself became a quieter province. The grandeur of Lean, and later Castile, overshadowed its mountain roots. For the great movements of medieval Spain, the Reconquista, the rise of Castile, the wars with Al-Andalus, Asturias was remembered as the beginning, not the climax. Centuries later, chroniclers mythologized Asturias' origins. The Battle of Covadonga was retold as a miraculous victory, Paleo as a chosen leader, and the mountains as a sanctuary of divine protection. These stories became part of Spain's national memory, celebrated as the dawn of the Reconquista. But in its own time, Asturias was not so grand. It was a modest kingdom of farmers, monks, and mountain lords clinging to survival in a remote land. Standing in Asturias today, you can still see traces of that world. The Church of Santa Maria del Naranco, once a royal hall, still overlooks green hills. San Julian de los Prados preserves faded frescoes painted more than 1,000 years ago. In Covadonga, a shrine now marks the site where Paleo supposedly turned the tide of history. Pilgrims and tourists alike walk these places, often unaware that they were once the beating heart of resistance. However small, Asturias' story reminds us that history is not only written by great empires. Sometimes it is carried forward by small kingdoms, born of desperation, sustained by geography, and remembered not for wealth but for endurance. Without Asturias, Christian Spain may not have survived, and yet, for centuries, it has been almost forgotten, overshadowed by the crowns that succeeded it. And so we end with this thought. Perhaps the most important legacies are not the loudest, but the quietest. Asturias left few monuments and fewer names, but it left an idea that a people, however small, can endure against overwhelming odds, and that idea, born in the midst of mountains, shaped the destiny of a continent. If Asturias was born in rugged isolation, its neighbor to the east, the Kingdom of Navarre, grew out of crossroads, nestled in the Pyrenees, straddling the lands between what is now Spain and France. Navarre was a kingdom shaped by geography as much as by politics. It was neither entirely Iberian nor entirely French. It belonged to mountains, passes, and valleys that connected to worlds. For centuries, it survived not by dominating neighbors but by balancing them, always adapting to pressures that came from both sides of the mountains. Navarre's heart lay in the Ebro River Valley, and the passes of the western Pyrenees. To the north, paths led into Aquitaine and Gascony. To the south, roads descended into the plains of Iberia. Merchants, soldiers, and pilgrims alike crossed these routes, bringing with them goods, languages, and influences. To stand in Navarre was to stand in between Latin and Basque tongues, between Roman and Moorish legacies, and between Christian and Muslim powers. The origins of Navarre lie with the Basques, a people whose language and identity were distinct from both Latin and Germanic traditions. For centuries after Rome, Basque valleys preserved autonomy, resisting both Visigothic rule and Muslim expansion. When the Muslim conquest swept across Iberia in the 8th century, the Pyrenees proved difficult terrain. Local lords offered tribute when necessary, but the region remained stubbornly independent. Out of this patchwork of mountain communities emerged a dynasty, the Egigots, who would form the basis of the Kingdom of Pamplona, the early name for what would later be called Navarre. The decisive moment came in 778 when Charlemagne's army, retreating through the Pyrenees after a campaign in Iberia, was ambushed at Roncesvalles Pass. The Basques, defending their land, destroyed the rear guard of the Frankish army, killing Roland, one of Charlemagne's commanders. The event became a legend in Europe, immortalized in the Song of Roland. But for the Basques, it was a defense of independence. This act of resistance shaped the reputation of the Pyrenees, a land difficult to conquer, where even the greatest emperor could be humbled. By the early 9th century, the Basques consolidated under Egigo Arista, considered the first king of Pamplona. His kingdom was small, centered on the city of Pamplona, surrounded by mountains and valleys. It was not rich, nor heavily populated, but it was strategically placed. To the south, Muslim rulers of Al-Andalus pressed for tribute. To the north, the Carolingians sought control. The kings of Pamplona survived by maneuvering between them, sometimes allied with Muslims, sometimes with Franks, always guarding their autonomy. Daily life in early Navarre was modest. Villages clung to valleys where streams provided water for barley and wheat fields. Terraced hillsides grew vines and olives. Sheep and cattle grazed in high pastures, their seasonal migrations forming the rhythm of the year. The Basques were renowned for their herding and their resilience, moving flocks through mountain passes long before the kingdom existed. Families lived in stone houses with slate roofs, clustered around small churches where priests conducted services in Latin. While people still spoke Basque at home, trade flowed through Navarre in quiet but steady streams. Pilgrims began traveling the Camino de Santiago, the route to the shrine of St. James in Galicia, and many passed through Navarrese towns. Inns, markets, and small bridges appeared along the way, serving travelers who carried not only devotion, but also news and ideas. Merchants moved salt, wool, wine, and iron through the passes, making Navarre a waypoint in Europe's commerce. Religion, as in Asturias, shaped identity. Christianity was firmly established, with monasteries appearing in valleys, yet Navarre's faith carried traces of older traditions. Basque customs blended with Christian rituals, producing a local piety that was less about grandeur than about persistence. Small chapels dotted the hills, where villagers prayed for safe harvests, healthy flocks, and protection from raids. Faith was woven into the cycles of life. As ordinary as planting fields or tending sheep, the kingdom's kingship was fragile. Authority depended on alliances, oaths, and the shifting loyalty of nobles. Power in Navarre was less centralized than in larger kingdoms. It rested on relationships between the crown and local lords who controlled valleys. Disputes were common, often settled through negotiation or intermarriage rather than outright war. Navarre endured not because it was powerful, but because it was flexible, willing to bend, adapt, and survive. Yet always there was tension. Muslim armies raided north, demanding tribute and threatening towns. Frankish lords pressed south, seeking control of passes. Navarre stood between them. Too small to dominate, too stubborn to vanish. To live in Navarre was to live with uncertainty, yet also with continuity. Families farmed the same fields for generations, herded sheep through the same passes, and prayed in the same stone churches. Kingdoms rose and fell around them, but life in the Pyrenees continued. And so, as we pause at this point in Navarre's story, we see a kingdom born of geography and resilience, not grand, not wealthy, but stubbornly present. A place where empires stumbled, where mountains shielded villages, and where kings ruled not by conquest, but by survival. And so we ask, can a kingdom built on balance and compromise endure longer than one built on conquest and expansion? By the High Middle Ages, the Kingdom of Navarre had grown beyond its early days as a fragile refuge. It was no longer just Pamplona and its valleys, but a kingdom that stretched across the Pyrenees, commanding important passes and markets. Yet its growth never freed it from dependence on larger neighbors. Navarre's history became a long balancing act, caught between the ambitions of France to the north and the rising Christian kingdoms of Iberia to the south. In the 11th century, Navarre reached a peak under Sancho III the Great r. 1000 to 1035. Sancho married into influential dynasties, expanded his influence over Castile, Aragon, and Leon, and styled himself as ruler of a vast swath of Christian Spain. For a brief time, Navarre looked less like a small mountain state and more like a contender for dominance. His court in Pamplona welcomed nobles, bishops, and ambassadors. Roads and monasteries were supported, linking the kingdom to the wider world. Pilgrims on the Camino de Santiago passed through Navarre in greater numbers, making its valleys busy corridors of devotion and commerce. But Sancho's kingdom was not to last. Following his death, his lands were divided among his sons, as was customary. Castile and Aragon emerged as stronger, independent crowns, while Navarre retreated to its core. This pattern, brief moments of expansion followed by contraction, became Navarre's rhythm. It could never match the manpower of Castile, the resources of Aragon, or the influence of France. Instead, it survived by shifting alliances, by yielding when necessary, and by making itself useful as a bridge between worlds. For the people of Navarre, politics often felt distant. Their lives were tied to soil, flocks, and seasons. Villages nestled in valleys produced grain, grapes, and olives. Herds of sheep grazed in high pastures, their wool forming one of Navarre's most important exports. Shepherds moved flocks across mountains, following transhumance routes that connected valleys to summer meadows. Markets were small but lively. Stalls of salt, wool, wine, iron tools, and cheese filled town squares. Pilgrims passing through added coins to inns and taverns. The Camino de Santiago, which passed through towns like Punt la Reina and Estella, gave Navarre an importance beyond its size. Pilgrims from France, Germany, and even England crossed its bridges, prayed in its churches, and purchased food and lodging. Local people built hospitals for the sick, inns for the weary, and chapels for the devout. Pilgrimage brought steady traffic, weaving Navarre into a European network of devotion and trade. While armies came and went, the footsteps of pilgrims were constant, filling valleys with a quieter rhythm. Navarre's kings understood the value of this crossroads. They supported monasteries like Laer and Iraqi, which not only offered spiritual life but also controlled lands and educated elites. Monks copied manuscripts, preserved chronicles, and taught Latin. Churches in Romanesque style rose across the kingdom, their rounded arches and carved capitals showing the influence of France. The sound of bells marked time in valleys, calling villagers to worship and reminding them that their small kingdom was part of Christendom. Yet Navarre's strategic location was as dangerous as it was beneficial. Castile and Aragon eyed its passes as gateways to France. French lords and kings, in turn, sought to extend influence southward. Navarre's rulers often married into foreign dynasties to secure allies, but these marriages sometimes created more entanglements than protection. By the 12th and 13th centuries, Navarre frequently found itself partitioned, raided, or placed under the influence of greater powers. Still, life in the kingdom endured. Farmers harvested in autumn, gathered grapes for wine presses, and stored grain in communal granaries. Women wove cloth, prepared meals of bread, cheese, and stews, and managed households. Children helped in fields, fetched water from springs, and sometimes walked alongside pilgrims carrying staffs and shells. The rhythm of Navarre was modest, but it was steady. At the royal court, scribes kept records of treaties, taxes, and disputes. Nobles pledged loyalty in exchange for land and privileges. Knights maintained horses and arms. Though Navarre's forces were always small compared to neighboring kingdoms, kings ruled less by might and more by diplomacy, knowing that survival depended on making allies rather than enemies. Tribute might be paid 1 year, alliances sworn the next, and marriages arranged across borders to buy peace. What made Navarre distinct was its ability to remain itself despite these pressures. Its Basque heritage endured in language, names, and customs. Markets echoed with a mix of Basque, Romance, and French. Villagers celebrated saints' days with music and dances unique to their valleys. Local councils managed disputes, sometimes independently of royal decrees. In this sense, Navarre was less a centralized kingdom than a federation of valleys tied loosely to a crown. By the late Middle Ages, however, the noose of larger powers tightened. Castile expanded westward, Aragon eastward, and France pressed south. Navarre often found itself allied with one against the other, but such alliances rarely lasted. Its kings grew increasingly entangled in foreign dynasties, and the kingdom's independence began to look fragile. Still, it endured longer than many expected, its mountains shielding it, its valleys sustaining it, its people stubborn in their routines. And so, as we look at Navarre in this middle chapter, we see a kingdom that lived not by conquering but by adapting. Its survival was not in might but in balance. Its importance was not in size but in position. It was a kingdom where pilgrims walked, where farmers harvested, where kings negotiated, and where mountains gave both shelter and constraint. And so we pause with the question, is it better for a small kingdom to chase greatness and risk destruction, or to accept modest survival and endure through centuries? By the later Middle Ages, the kingdom of Navarre stood at a crossroads not only of geography, but also of fate. For centuries, it had survived by balancing greater powers. But as those powers grew stronger, Navarre's independence became increasingly fragile. Castile and Aragon consolidated into powerful crowns. France expanded southward, and Navarre, smaller than all of them, had to navigate carefully. It was no longer enough simply to survive in the mountains. Survival now depended on dynasties, treaties, and the shifting map of Europe in the 13th century. Navarre fell under the rule of French dynasties. Marriages had long linked the Navarrese crown with France, but these links eventually placed the kingdom under Capetian control. For many in Navarre, this was both protection and a threat. On the one hand, French kings brought prestige, connecting the small Pyrenean realm to one of Europe's great monarchies. On the other, it risked absorbing Navarre into France entirely. Navarre's courts continued to function, and local nobles retained influence. But the kingdom's independence grew weaker. Pamplona remained the symbolic heart. Its cathedral and walls standing against time. While smaller towns thrive on the Camino de Santiago, pilgrims still cross bridges and valleys, sustaining inns and taverns. Yet behind the routines of daily life, shepherds guiding flocks, farmers tending fields, women weaving and baking loomed the knowledge that their kingdom's future was not fully in their own hands. By the 15th century, Navarre's situation grew more precarious. To the south, the union of Castile and Aragon under Ferdinand and Isabella created a powerful Spanish monarchy. To the north, France remained a giant. Navarre was caught between the magnates, too small to resist both. Its rulers faced impossible choices: ally with one and risk the wrath of the other, or try to remain neutral and risk being swallowed by both. In 1512, the crisis reached its climax. Ferdinand of Aragon, acting for the newly unified Spain, invaded Navarre. The campaign was swift. Spanish troops occupied the southern part of the kingdom, and Pamplona fell. Though resistance continued, the outcome was clear. The southern half of Navarre was absorbed into Spain. The northern portion, across the Pyrenees, remained under French influence. Navarre was divided. Its independence effectively ended. For the people of Navarre, this shift was less dramatic in daily life than on political maps. Farmers still harvested barley, shepherds still led flocks to mountain pastures, and pilgrims still walked the Camino. Yet now taxes were collected in the name of foreign monarchs. Soldiers garrisoned towns, and laws were issued from distant courts. Local councils continued to manage affairs, but the crown of Navarre had become a memory rather than a reality. The division of Navarre persisted for centuries. Southern Navarre became part of Spain, integrated into its monarchy, while northern Navarre, lower Navarre, eventually merged with France. Today, the historic kingdom is split, remembered in names and traditions but not in sovereignty. Its mountains and valleys remain, and its language and customs endure in parts of the Basque Country. But the independent kingdom has long vanished. What survives most vividly are the traces of ordinary life and faith. The Camino de Santiago continues to bring pilgrims through Navarre, across the same bridges built centuries ago. Villages still cluster around stone churches where bells mark the hours. Traditional Basque festivals, with music, dances, and games, carry echoes of the kingdom's resilience. And in Pamplona, now famous for its running of the bulls, one can still stand before a cathedral that once housed the coronations of Navarre's kings. The memory of Navarre is one of modest endurance. It was never the most powerful kingdom of Iberia, nor the wealthiest, nor the most expansive, but it lasted for centuries, navigating between empires, preserving its culture, and surviving long after larger kingdoms had risen and fallen. Its history is not one of dramatic conquest, but of quiet persistence. And so, as we leave Navarre's story, we're left with a reflection. Is it better for a kingdom to blaze briefly in power, or to endure quietly across centuries, remembered not for glory, but for resilience? Navarre may be forgotten in many histories, overshadowed by Castile, Aragon, and France. But in its quiet endurance, it left a lesson that even small kingdoms, hemmed in by giants, can shape the story of Europe simply by surviving. To stand in Sicily is to stand at a crossroads of the Mediterranean. The island, shaped like a triangle and ringed with mountains, coasts, and fertile valleys, has always been a place where cultures meet, clash, and blend. Greeks settled its shores in antiquity. The Romans made it a province. Arab countries transformed their agriculture and cities, and Normans, arriving from the north, built a kingdom here that astonished Europe with its wealth, its architecture, and its diversity. This was the kingdom of Sicily, a realm that seemed improbable, yet for a time stood as one of the most remarkable kingdoms of medieval Europe. Sicily's position made it irresistible, lying at the heart of the Mediterranean. It controlled sea routes between east and west, north and south. Whoever ruled Sicily could influence trade from Spain to Egypt, from Italy to the Levant. Its soil, enriched by volcanic ash from Mount Etna, produced wheat, olives, and fruit in abundance. Its coast offered harbors where ships from every land could anchor, and so Sicily was never isolated. It was always connected, sometimes by trade, sometimes by conquest. Before the Normans, Sicily had already been transformed by centuries of change. In the 9th century, Arab forces from North Africa conquered the island from Byzantine rule. For 200 years, it was part of the Islamic world, and under their administration, it flourished. The Arabs introduced new crops, citrus fruits, sugarcane, cotton, and new techniques of irrigation. Terraces, canals, and water wheels turned valleys into gardens. Cities like Palermo grew into thriving centers of trade and culture, filled with markets, mosques, and palaces. Life under Arab Sicily was a blend of traditions. Muslims formed the ruling elite, but Christians and Jews continued to live on the island, paying special taxes but contributing to society as farmers, merchants, and craftsmen. Markets sold spices, textiles, and metalwork. Scholars studied in Arabic, Greek, and Latin. Mosques echoed with the call to prayer, while churches held mass in Greek rites. It was not always peaceful, but it was profoundly diverse. Into this world came the Normans, descendants of Viking settlers who had made their home in northern France. By the 11th century, Norman adventurers were carving out territories in southern Italy. Skilled warriors and ambitious leaders, they gradually turned their attention to Sicily. In 1061, led by Robert Guiscard and his brother Roger, the Normans began their conquest of the island. Over 3 decades of campaigns, they wrested Sicily from Muslim control, completing the conquest in 1091. The result was extraordinary: a Norman kingdom of Sicily that inherited the wealth of the Arabs, the traditions of the Byzantines, and the vigor of the Latin West. Roger II, crowned king in 1130, transformed Sicily into one of the most advanced states of the age. His court in Palermo blended cultures in ways that astonished contemporaries. Latin, Greek, and Arabic were all used in administration. Muslim scholars worked alongside Christian clerics. Greek craftsmen decorated churches while Arab architects designed palaces. The result was a fusion that has left some of the most beautiful monuments of medieval Europe. The Palatine Chapel in Palermo, where gold and Byzantine mosaics shine above Islamic-style arches and wooden ceilings carved with Arabic inscriptions. Daily life in Norman Sicily reflected this diversity. In Palermo, markets bustled with merchants speaking many tongues. Arab farmers cultivated citrus groves outside the city, while Greek-speaking peasants tilled fields and land. Latin knights rode through streets in armor, passing Jewish artisans at work in their shops. Food reflected this blend: bread and olive oil from Roman tradition, spices and sugar from Arab influence, fish and wine from the Mediterranean. Music and poetry mixed languages and rhythms, echoing across courtyards. For ordinary people, life was hard, but also enriched by this mixture of cultures. What set the Kingdom of Sicily apart was not only its diversity, but its stability. While much of Europe struggled with feudal fragmentation, Sicily under the Normans was a centralized monarchy. The king controlled taxes, justice, and the army. Roger II and his successors built a strong administration, employing not only Latin nobles but also Arab scribes and Greek officials. The result was efficiency that astonished travelers. Laws recorded carefully, markets regulated, roads maintained. It was a kingdom that, for a time, functioned better than larger and older states. And yet, behind this prosperity lay fragility. Sicily's wealth made it coveted. Its location made it vulnerable. Powerful neighbors, the papacy, the Holy Roman Empire, and rival Italian states all looked toward the island. The very diversity that enriched Sicily could also become a source of tension. But for now, in this first part of its story, Sicily stands in its golden age, a kingdom where Normans, Arabs, and Greeks lived and ruled together, creating a blend unlike anywhere else in Europe. And so we pause with a question: can a kingdom built on diversity and compromise endure? Or does its very mixture make it too fragile to last? When we think of kingdoms, we often imagine their courts, kings in golden halls, nobles in glittering armor, and scholars debating beneath painted ceilings. But kingdoms live not only through rulers, they survive through the rhythms of daily life: farmers in fields, merchants in markets, monks in cloisters, and artisans at their benches. In Sicily under the Normans, these rhythms were shaped by the island's remarkable mixture of peoples and traditions. Agriculture formed the foundation. Sicily's soil, enriched by volcanic ash from Mount Etna, was among the most fertile in the Mediterranean. Arab settlers had introduced advanced irrigation techniques during their centuries of real water wheels known as norias, underground channels, and terrace fields. The Normans preserved and expanded these systems, recognizing their value. Fields of wheat rippled in summer winds, providing grain not only for Sicilian bread, but also for export across the sea. Groves of olive trees covered hillsides, their fruit pressed into oil stored in clay jars. Vineyards supplied wine for local use and for trade. More unusual crops marked Sicily as different from northern Europe. Citrus fruits, oranges, lemons, and limes grew in orchards, their fragrance filling the air. Sugarcane flourished, cut and processed into syrup and crystals that sweetened foods long before sugar became common in the north. Cotton fields added to the island's wealth, their fibers spun into cloth. These crops were not simply luxuries. They reflected Sicily's role as a bridge between the Arab world and Latin Christendom. For a traveler from France or England, to taste Sicilian oranges or see sugar refined would have felt exotic, almost miraculous. Daily labor in villages followed predictable patterns. At dawn, farmers led oxen into fields, their wooden plows cutting furrows in the soil. Shepherds drove flocks of sheep and goats into pastures, their bells echoing in the hills. Women spun wool, baked flatbreads, and carried water from communal fountains. Children helped tend animals or gathered firewood. In coastal towns, fishermen launched boats at sunrise, hauling in nets of sardines, anchovies, and tuna. These catches were salted or dried to feed both locals and distant markets. Markets brought these goods together. Palermo, the capital, was famous for its bustling souks. Inherited from Arab times, stalls displayed spices, cinnamon, pepper, and saffron brought by traders from the east. Piles of dried fruit, figs, and dates sat alongside sacks of grain. Artisans sold pottery, tools, and textiles. Jewish merchants traded in dyes and cloth. Greek craftsmen offered icons and carved wood. Arab artisans sold glassware and jewelry. In these markets, languages mingled: Arabic, Greek, Latin, Hebrew, and Norman French might all be heard in a single morning. Religion added another rhythm. The Norman kings were Latin Christians, and cathedrals rose in Romanesque style, decorated with Byzantine mosaics. Yet Greek-speaking Christians continued to worship in their own rites, preserving traditions from Byzantium. Muslims, though no longer rulers, still lived across the island, paying special taxes but allowed to practice their faith. Their mosques sometimes became churches, but their calligraphy and artistry endured. Jews maintained synagogues in towns, contributing to trade and scholarship. For ordinary people, this meant that one might pass from a Latin mass to a Greek liturgy, from a Jewish shop to a Muslim craftsman's stall in the same neighborhood. Architecture reflected this diversity. The Palatine Chapel in Palermo remains its most vivid symbol. Built under Roger II, it combined elements from all cultures: golden mosaics of Christ and saints in Byzantine style, wooden ceilings carved and painted with Islamic designs, and Latin inscriptions alongside Arabic ones. For the king, this was not a contradiction, but a demonstration of visual statement that his kingdom embraced all traditions under his crown. For ordinary visitors, it must have been bewildering and awe-inspiring. Daily justice and governance were equally blended. Norman kings employed Muslim scribes, Greek notaries, and Latin clerks. Laws were issued in multiple languages so that all subjects could understand them. Taxes were carefully recorded, harvest yields measured, markets regulated, and tolls collected on trade routes. For peasants, this meant stability, though it also meant obligations. Grain had to be delivered, flocks counted, and coin paid. What distinguished Sicily was the efficiency of its system, compared to the patchwork rule of feudal Europe. Here, the crown was strong, and its reach extended even into remote valleys. Food in Sicily reflected its cultural mix. Bread baked in clay ovens formed the staple. Olive oil-flavored stews of beans, lentils, and vegetables. Fish was grilled or salted. Spices such as cumin and saffron, rare in northern Europe, flavored rice and meat dishes. Sugar appeared in pastries filled with nuts and honey. Even pasta, introduced from the Arab world, began to take root. Meals were simple for peasants but remarkably rich in variety compared to elsewhere in Europe. Festivals brought color to this life. Christian holy days filled towns with processions, candles, and bells. Markets bustled with extra trade, and feasts featured roasted meat, wine, and music. Muslim communities marked Ramadan and Eid in quieter ways, while Jewish families kept their Sabbath traditions. These overlapping calendars created a rhythm of constant observance, where faith shaped not only devotion, but also the cycles of work and rest. Yet beneath the apparent harmony, tension existed. Norman rulers favored Latin Christians, granting them privileges. Muslims, though tolerated, were slowly pushed to the margins. Over time, some converted to Christianity to avoid taxes or gain opportunities. Jews, though protected, faced restrictions. The kingdom's diversity was real, but it required careful balance, and balance is always fragile. Still, for more than a century, Sicily offered an example of coexistence unusual for its time. Travelers from across Europe marveled at its order and wealth. Chroniclers described Palermo as one of the richest cities of Christendom, its harbor filled with ships, its streets alive with trade. To walk there was to see a world where cultures did not simply clash but combined. And so, in the second part of the story, Sicily appears less as a battlefield and more as a mosaic, a kingdom where wheat and sugar grew, side by side, where Latin, Greek, and Arabic echoed in markets, and where a chapel could shine with Christian saints under Islamic ceilings. But such mosaics are fragile. They hold together only so long as power enforces balance. And so we must ask, how long can a kingdom of many peoples endure before its harmony begins to crack? The kingdom of Sicily, so vibrant under the Normans, could not remain untouched by the wider tides of Mediterranean politics. For more than a century, it dazzled travelers with its wealth, its mosaics, its gardens, and its unusual coexistence of peoples. But kingdoms, like mosaics, are fragile. Their pieces can scatter when the binding force weakens. By the late 12th century, the golden age of Norman Sicily began to fade, not in sudden collapse, but in gradual shifts of power that left the island contested, divided, and eventually absorbed into the ambitions of larger empires. The decline began after the death of William II the Good in 1189. Without a clear heir, Sicily's throne became a prize for outsiders. The powerful Holy Roman Emperor Henry VI, through marriage to Constance of Hauteville, the last Norman princess, claimed the crown in 1194. His armies invaded and took Palermo. The Norman dynasty ended, replaced by German emperors of the Hohenstaufen line. For many Sicilians, this meant that the kings who had once ruled from Palermo now governed from distant lands, seeing the island less as a home and more as a possession. The Hohenstaufen rulers, especially Frederick II or 1197 to 1250, left their own mark. Born in Sicily, Frederick was raised in Palermo's cosmopolitan court, absorbing Latin, Greek, Arabic, and Italian influences. He carried forward the Norman tradition of tolerance for a time, employing Muslim scholars and administrators, even while tensions grew between Christian authorities and Muslim communities. His reign was brilliant in intellect. He was called Super Mundi, the wonder of the world, but Sicily's autonomy declined as imperial politics tied it to conflicts. with the papacy and German ambitions. For ordinary Sicilians, life under foreign rulers was both familiar and altered. Fields still produced wheat and citrus, irrigation channels still carried water, and markets still sold spices and sugar. But new taxes were levied, soldiers from afar garrisoned towns, and royal attention shifted away from the island. The sense of being the center of a unique kingdom faded, replaced by the feeling of being a province in larger struggles. By the mid-13th century, the balance of Sicily's diversity had fractured. Muslim communities, once integrated, faced growing hostility. Many were deported or resettled in southern Italy, breaking the centuries-old coexistence that had defined Norman rule. Latin Christianity tightened its grip, while Greek traditions survived mostly in rural villages. The mosaic was still visible but now cracked. After Frederick II's death, Sicily became a battleground between the papacy, the French Angevins, and the Spanish crown of Aragon. The conflict came to a head in 1282 with the Sicilian Vespers, a popular uprising against French rule. On Easter Monday in Palermo, locals rebelled against Angevin soldiers, killing them in the streets. The revolt spread across the island, driving out the French and inviting the crown of Aragon to take control. The event was both a victory for Sicilian autonomy and a reminder of its vulnerability. The island was coveted, and its people would rise violently when pushed too far. The Aragonese era tied Sicily to the Spanish world. Palermo remained important, but decisions increasingly flowed from Barcelona and later Madrid. Sicily was no longer a kingdom that astonished Europe with its independence. It was a province within larger crowns. Its fields still fed markets. Its harbors still sheltered ships. But its golden age of multicultural brilliance had passed. Over time, the memory of Norman Sicily became legend. Travelers still admired the mosaics of Monreale, the Palatine Chapel, and the cathedrals of Palermo and Cefalù. Citrus groves and gardens still testified to Arab irrigation, but the living mixture of Latin, knights, Greek monks, Arab farmers, and Jewish merchants faded into the past. Sicily became poorer, more rural, and more dependent on distant rulers. The island's role as a Mediterranean crossroads remained, but now it was less a place of innovation and more a prize in others' struggles. For ordinary Sicilians in these later centuries, life meant hardship. Heavy taxation drained villages, trade declined as warfare disrupted routes. Famine and plague struck, reducing populations. Yet the rhythms of agriculture continued, sowing grain in autumn, harvesting in summer, tending orchards, pressing olives, boiling sugar cane, and fishing the seas. Religion continued to mark the calendar. Processions filled towns, and families passed down traditions. The kingdom's brilliance was gone, but life endured in quiet persistence. Today, to walk in Sicily is to see remnants of the golden past. The Palatine Chapel still glitters with mosaics. Christ Pantocrator gazes from the dome, surrounded by saints, beneath a ceiling of Islamic arabesques. The cloisters of Monreale still echo with carved columns showing scenes of animals, plants, and biblical stories. Streets of Palermo still carry Arab-inspired names. Oranges and lemons still grow in groves planted 1,000 years ago. The memory of a time when Normans, Arabs, and Greeks once ruled together remains carved into stone and whispered in traditions. And so Sicily's story ends not with sudden ruin, but with transformation. Its kingdom passed into the hands of others, its diversity narrowed, and its autonomy lost. Yet its legacy remains, not only in ruins and mosaics, but also in the idea that for a time, in one corner of Europe, peoples of different faiths and traditions built a kingdom together. And so we pause with a question: is the greatness of a kingdom measured by its longevity, or by the brief brilliance with which it shines before fading into memory? When you hear the word Burgundy today, you may think first of wine-deep red vintages from rolling hills in eastern France. Yet long before vineyards gave the name its modern fame, Burgundy was a kingdom, a shifting realm that rose and fell across the heart of medieval Europe, forgotten by many outside of scholars. The kingdom of Burgundy once stretched from the Alps to the Rhine, from Provence to Lake Geneva. It was a middle kingdom, never as dominant as France or Germany, never as mysterious as Italy, but always as important as the land in between. Its origins reach back to the migration period of the 5th century, when a Germanic tribe, the Burgundians, moved into Roman Gaul. They carved out a realm along the Rhine River, mingling with Gallo-Roman populations, adopting Christianity, and leaving their name to the land. This first kingdom was swept into the tides of history, falling under Frankish rule, but its name endured. Over the centuries, Burgundy was redefined again and again, sometimes a duchy, sometimes a county, sometimes a kingdom. What persisted was the idea of Burgundy as a place between worlds, between France, Germany, and Italy. By the 9th and 10th centuries, after the breakup of Charlemagne's empire, Burgundy emerged once more as an independent kingdom. In fact, there were two Burgundies: Upper Burgundy, centered around Lake Geneva, and Lower Burgundy, stretching into Provence. In 933, these were united into the Kingdom of Arles, often called the Second Kingdom of Burgundy. Though rarely powerful in the sense of armies and conquests, it occupied a strategic corridor of Europe. Trade routes passed through its valleys, linking Italy to France and the Rhine to the Rhine. To control Burgundy was to control passage. Life in Burgundy during this time was less about grandeur and more about endurance. The Rhine Valley supported agriculture, vineyards climbing hillsides, fields of grain waving in the wind, and orchards heavy with fruit. Peasants worked these lands under the authority of lords and monasteries. Stone villages clustered along rivers, their churches marking the center of community life. Markets sold cheese, wine, and salt. Pilgrims walked through Burgundy on their way to Santiago or Rome, stopping in abbeys for rest and prayer. Monasteries were among the most important institutions in Burgundy. The Abbey of Cluny, founded in 910, became one of the most influential religious centers in Europe. Its monks emphasized liturgy, prayer, and independence from secular lords, setting standards for reform across Christendom. Cluny's influence extended far beyond Burgundy, but for the people of the kingdom, it meant that valleys echoed with chants, and villages were tied to monastic rhythms. Fields around monasteries were cultivated by peasants, rents were paid in grain, and festivals followed the church calendar. Politically, the kings of Burgundy were often overshadowed by their neighbors. The Holy Roman Empire, France, and Italy all cast long shadows over the region. Burgundy rarely fielded large armies or ambitious campaigns. Instead, its rulers survived by compromise, alliances, and serving as intermediaries. It was a kingdom that mattered not because it conquered, but because it sat between conquerors. For ordinary Burgundians, life meant farming vineyards, tending livestock, and paying dues to lords. In the Jura Mountains, herders grazed cattle and made cheese, traditions that survive today. Along the Rhine, merchants moved goods by boat, carrying salt, cloth, and wine. In alpine passes, mule trains transported grain and tools. The land was not rich by comparison to fertile plains elsewhere, but it was steady, sustaining generations. What made Burgundy distinct was its role as a middle kingdom. It was a crossroads. Pilgrims, merchants, soldiers, and clerics all passed through. Languages overlapped Latin in churches, local Romance dialects in villages, and Germanic tongues in valleys near the Rhine. Customs blended, travelers left coins and stories. Monks recorded chronicles, towns grew at the crossing points of trade routes. And yet, despite its importance as a connector, Burgundy rarely commanded attention in the great chronicles of kings and wars. It was remembered less for battles and more for its abbeys, its wines, and its quiet presence on the map. Perhaps that is why it has faded from memory. And so we pause with a question. Can a kingdom whose power lay not in conquest, but in quiet endurance be remembered as great? Or does history only honor those who make the most noise? The strength of Burgundy was never in its armies nor its kings, but in the steady pulse of life that continued in its valleys, towns, and monasteries. To live in Burgundy in the Middle Ages was to live in a land that connected others, a kingdom of passes and corridors, where merchants, pilgrims, and ideas moved steadily through. Agriculture formed the backbone. Along the valleys of the Seine and Rhine, peasants tended fields of wheat, barley, and rye. Vineyards climbed the slopes, producing wine that even then carried a reputation. The Burgundian climate, cooler than Mediterranean regions, yielded sturdy, earthy vintages that traveled by barrel along riverboats. Orchards provided apples, pears, and plums. In alpine pastures, cattle grazed, producing milk that became cheeses stored in caves. Daily meals for peasants were simple: black bread, pottage of beans and vegetables, cheese, and on rare days, a bit of meat. Work followed the rhythm of seasons. Spring demanded plowing and planting. Summer meant long hours in fields and vineyards. Autumn was the busiest, grain harvested, grapes crushed, apples pressed. Winter slowed the pace, with families gathered near hearths, mending tools, spinning wool, and telling stories. Even in hardship, life moved in circles. The turning of the year anchoring families to land. Monasteries shaped Burgundy's identity more than its kings did. The Abbey of Cluny, founded in the 10th century, became a beacon of reform. Its liturgy was long and elaborate, its influence vast. Pilgrims and monks came from across Europe to witness its devotion. Cluny's network of daughter houses spread Burgundian influence as far as Spain and England. In daily life, this meant valleys echoed with bells. The sound of monks chanting the hours drifted into fields, reminding peasants that time was not only measured in sunrise and sunset, but also in sacred intervals of prayer. Other monasteries, like Citeaux, added new dimensions. Founded in 1098, Citeaux launched the Cistercian order, emphasizing simplicity, manual labor, and austere devotion. Unlike Cluny's grandeur, Cistercians lived with minimal decoration, focusing on work and prayer. They drained marshes, cleared forests, and expanded agriculture. Their granges, or farmsteads, dotted the countryside, where lay brothers worked alongside peasants for Burgundy. This meant more land under cultivation, more organized farming, and a legacy of stone abbeys still visible today. Trade routes gave Burgundy life beyond its fields. The Rhine carried goods north and south. Boats laden with salt from Provence, wine from Burgundy, and cloth from Flanders passed through. Mule trains crossed the Jura, carrying grain, iron tools, and wool. Markets in Dijon, Lyon, and Geneva bustled with merchants. Fairs brought together traders from Italy, France, and Germany, who exchanged spices, leather, furs, and silks. Pilgrims added another stream of movement. Many traveling to Santiago de Compostela passed through Burgundy, stopping at monasteries for rest. Roads filled with groups carrying staffs and shells, their presence supporting inns, taverns, and hospitals for villagers. The sight of pilgrims was both ordinary and remarkable, a reminder that their quiet kingdom lay on Europe's great spiritual map. Language and culture reflected Burgundy's position as a crossroads in towns. Romance dialects mixed with Latin, and valleys near the Rhine, Germanic tones were common. Clergy wrote in Latin, nobles spoke in French or Occitan, and peasants used local dialects. Songs and tales carried influences from many directions. A Burgundian ballad might echo rhythms from Provence, while a carving on a church portal might blend Romanesque forms with German motifs. Life for ordinary Burgundians was neither grand nor easy. Peasants owed rents and labor to lords, whether noble or monastic. Taxes might be collected in grain, cheese, or labor days spent repairing roads. Protection from raids was promised, though Burgundy rarely saw the scale of wars that devastated other lands. Lords and abbots ruled, but their power often overlapped, creating a patchwork of obligations. For the farmer in a valley, it mattered little whether a king in Arles or an emperor in Germany claimed authority. What mattered was how much tax was owed and when. Yet Burgundy also had moments of color. Fairs and festivals brought relief from labor at harvest time. Communities gathered for feasts of roasted meats, wine, and dancing. Church processions filled streets with banners and incense. In winter, storytelling and songs warmed long nights. Pilgrims brought tales of distant shrines. Merchants brought foreign goods, and monks carried knowledge from libraries. In a quiet way, Burgundy was more connected to the world than its modest size suggested. Castles dotted the landscape, though they were often small fortresses of stone on hilltops rather than massive palaces. Nobles guarded passes, collected tolls, and occasionally clashed with neighbors. Their lives revolved around hunting, feasting, and maintaining networks of vassals. Knights in Burgundy were fewer than in France or Germany, but they carried the same obligations: service in war, loyalty to lords, and defense of their lands. For most, however, the defining presence was the church. Stone parish churches stood in every village, often simple buildings with rounded arches and bell towers. Inside, frescoes showed saints, devils, and visions of heaven. Priests baptized children, married couples, and buried the dead. The rhythm of life planting, harvest, sickness, famine was interpreted through faith. Thus Burgundy endured, not through conquests or great kings, but through the steady weaving of daily labor, monastic devotion, and the flow of trade and pilgrimage. Its people plowed fields, brewed wine, copied manuscripts, and built churches. Its valleys hummed with work, its monasteries with prayer, and its markets with commerce. It was a kingdom of continuity, not spectacle. And so we pause with a question in the long memory of history. Is the quiet work of farmers and monks less important than the victories of kings? Or does it form the true foundation of Europe's survival? By the late Middle Ages, the Kingdom of Burgundy stood at a crossroads not only of Europe as geography, but also of its destiny. For centuries, it had endured as a quiet, middle realm, its power lying more in abbeys, trade routes, and vineyards than in armies. But kingdoms rarely stay still. By the 11th and 12th centuries, the tides of power shifted, and Burgundy was gradually absorbed into the ambitions of larger states. Its decline was not marked by one dramatic conquest, but by centuries of integration, treaties, and slow fading from memory. The turning point came in 1032, when the last king of an independent Burgundy, Rudolph III, died without an heir. His lands, often called the Kingdom of Arles or the Second Burgundy, passed to the Holy Roman Emperor Conrad II. From that point onward, Burgundy was officially part of the empire, though in practice it remained loosely governed. The emperors, based in Germany, rarely visited the Rhine valleys or the Alpine passes. Burgundy retained its own customs, lords, and monasteries, but it no longer had kings of its own. For ordinary people, this shift changed little at first. Peasants still worked fields, monks still prayed in abbeys, and merchants still carried wine and salt along rivers. Taxes were collected in the name of distant emperors, but authority on the ground remained with local lords, bishops, and abbots. A farmer in the Jura Mountains or a vintner near Dijon likely noticed no difference. When Burgundy changed hands, the rhythms of sowing, harvesting, and praying continued as before. Yet over time, the absence of a native crown meant that Burgundy's identity as a kingdom weakened. Local rulers gained strength, especially the Dukes of Burgundy, whose duchy centered around Dijon grew wealthy and powerful in its own right. By the 14th and 15th centuries, the Duchy of Burgundy became one of the richest and most glamorous courts of Europe, overshadowing the memory of the Old Kingdom. The Dukes Philip the Bold, John the Fearless, and Philip the Good were remembered not as heirs of a Middle Kingdom, but as nearly independent princes, challenging both France and the Empire. Meanwhile, the lands of Provence and Savoy developed their own trajectories. The patchwork that had once been united as the Kingdom of Burgundy fractured into duchies, counties, and provinces, each tied more closely to France, Switzerland, or the Empire. The kingdom had vanished, not in fire or conquest, but in quiet absorption. Still, Its legacy remained in certain institutions. The abbeys of Cluny and Citeaux continued to shape European monastic life. Pilgrimage routes still cross Burgundy, with towns like Vézelay serving as starting points for the Camino de Santiago. The wine of Burgundy grew in reputation, its vineyards cultivated with techniques refined over generations. Though kings no longer sat in Arles or Geneva, Burgundy continued to matter in subtler ways. Daily life in the later centuries of Burgundy followed familiar rhythms, even as maps changed. Farmers harvested grain and grapes, shepherds grazed flocks in alpine meadows, townspeople traded cloth, leather, and tools in markets, lords collected dues, monasteries stored tithes, and priests preached in parish churches. Wars occasionally passed through armies of France or the Empire clashing nearby, but Burgundy was rarely the main prize. It was, as ever, the land in between. By the early modern era, the very idea of a kingdom of Burgundy had faded. France absorbed much of its western territory. Switzerland claimed parts of its alpine lands, and the empire retained nominal claims over the rest. When people spoke of Burgundy, they increasingly meant the duchy, famous for its court and its wines, rather than the Old Kingdom. The Middle Kingdom had become a forgotten chapter in Europe's crowded story. Today, to stand in Burgundy is to see fragments of its past. Vineyards still stretch across hillsides, producing wines whose names echo in markets far beyond France. Romanesque churches still dot the countryside, their stone arches weathered but enduring. The ruins of Cluny remind visitors of a monastery that once guided all of Christendom. And in museums and chronicles, the name of Burgundy lingers, though rarely linked to the kingdom it once was. The kingdom of Burgundy is forgotten not because it failed, but because it succeeded quietly. It did not fall in a blaze of glory, nor did it dominate Europe. It endured for centuries, feeding people, hosting monks and pilgrims, and serving as a bridge between worlds. Its fate was to be absorbed into greater powers, but its entrance made possible much of what came after. And so, as we close the story of Burgundy, we ask, is history more shaped by the kingdoms that roar and collapse, or by those that endure quietly until they are forgotten? Burgundy, Europe's Middle Kingdom, reminds us that sometimes the most important work of history is the steady, unremarkable survival that sustains the rest. In the heart of Central Europe lies Bohemia, a land of forests, rivers, and hills that today forms much of the Czech Republic. For centuries, it was more than a province. It was a kingdom, one whose rulers claimed crowns, whose land sat at the crossroads of Europe, and whose story blends modest endurance with moments of brilliance. Though many Americans know the word Bohemian is a synonym for free-spirited wandering, few know that it once referred to a real medieval kingdom, the Kingdom of Bohemia. Sometimes called the jewel of Central Europe, Bohemia's geography shaped its destiny. The land is ringed by mountains, the Sudetes to the north, the Bohemian forest to the west and south, and the Carpathian stretching toward the east. These natural barriers gave the kingdom protection, while the fertile basin of the Elbe and Vltava rivers provided rich farmland. Forests offered timber, rivers carried trade, and hills had veins of silver that would later enrich kings. Bohemia was not vast like France or the Holy Roman Empire, but it was secure, productive, and well-positioned. Its people descended from Slavic tribes who settled the region in the early Middle Ages. By the 9th century, they came under the rule of the Premyslit dynasty, whose chieftains slowly consolidated power. The arrival of Christianity, spread through missionaries from both east and west, gave Bohemia a new identity. Churches rose in wooden villages, and priests began recording names in Latin. In 973, Prague received its first bishopric, placing Bohemia firmly within Latin Christendom. Prague itself grew as the kingdom's heart. Nestled along the Vltava River, it was ideally placed for trade routes between Germany and Poland. By the 11th century, the city had stone walls, a castle on the hill, and markets bustling with merchants. Timber and grain from the countryside filled stalls, while foreign traders brought salt, cloth, and metal goods. The castle became both a fortress and a symbol, housing kings and their courts. Around it, churches and monasteries rose, their bells marking time. The Primoslid rulers expanded their influence, sometimes by sword, sometimes by marriage. They owed nominal allegiance to the Holy Roman Empire. The Bohemian rulers wielded considerable independence. In 1085, Vladislav II became the first to be crowned king of Bohemia, though the title was not yet hereditary. Later, in 1198, Ottokar I secured recognition of a permanent royal crown for Bohemia. From then onward, Bohemia was firmly established as a kingdom, not merely a duchy. Daily life in early Bohemia revolved around agriculture. Peasants cleared forests to open fields, growing rye, oats, and barley. Cabbages, onions, and beans filled gardens, while pigs rooted in oak forests for acorns. Honey provided sweetener before sugar was known. Villages were clusters of wooden houses with thatched roofs. Smoke rising from hearths. Families lived close to animals, sharing warmth in cold winters. Life was laborious, but the land was generous compared to harsher climates farther north. Religion shaped both calendar and culture. Parish churches stood at the center of villages, their priests baptizing, marrying, and burying parishioners. Monasteries dotted the countryside, bringing literacy, manuscripts, and stability. The story of Saint Wenceslas, the Duke martyred in the 10th century, became central to Bohemian identity. His cult spread, and he was revered as the patron saint of the land. Even centuries later, his hymn was sung by peasants in fields and by nobles in courts. Silver mining became another pillar of Bohemia's importance. By the 13th century, veins of silver near Kutna Hora turned the kingdom into one of Europe's economic engines. Miners dug shafts into hills, hauling ore to be smelted into coinage. The famous Prague groschen, minted in the 14th century, circulated widely, carrying Bohemia's name across Europe. For miners, life was harsh long hours underground, danger of collapse, and reliance on wooden supports, but their labor filled the royal treasury. The Primoslid kings balanced power carefully. They granted lands to nobles and bishops, yet maintained enough authority to keep the kingdom unified. Castles guarded river crossings, lords managed estates, and peasants owed labor and dues. Compared to France or Germany, Bohemia's monarchy was relatively stable, less fractured by constant rebellion. Its strength came not from vast armies but from its resources: fertile soil, timber, and silver. By the 13th century, Bohemia was recognized as one of the key states of the Holy Roman Empire. Its king held the prestigious title of elector, meaning he had a vote in choosing the emperor. This gave Bohemian rulers influence far beyond their borders. Though small, the kingdom was not marginal. It was a jewel in the empire's crown. And yet, as always with kingdoms, stability was never absolute. Ambitious rulers could overreach, nobles could resist, and neighbors could invade. Bohemia's history is one of balance between empire and autonomy, between Slavic roots and Latin Christianity, and between quiet survival and sudden flashes of brilliance. So in this opening view, we see Bohemia in its rise, a land of forests and rivers, a kingdom made strong not by conquest but by geography, resources, and the steadiness of its people. Its silver would one day shine in markets across Europe. Its kings would stand among the electors of emperors, and its capital, Prague, would be called the jewel of Central Europe. And so we pause with a question: can a kingdom defined more by quiet prosperity than by dramatic wars be remembered as one of Europe's crowns? Or must glory always be measured in battles? If the early centuries of Bohemia were about survival and recognition, the High Middle Ages were about prosperity and influence. By the 13th and 14th centuries, Bohemia was no longer a marginal land of forests and rivers. It was a kingdom whose silver, cities, and kings gave it a central role in Europe. Yet beneath the grandeur of courts and coinage, the lives of ordinary people, peasants, miners, monks, and merchants, carried the kingdom forward. The silver of Kutna Hora. At the heart of Bohemia's prosperity was silver. The discovery of rich deposits near Kutna Hora in the late 13th century transformed the kingdom's economy. Mines spread across hillsides, shafts plunging deep into the earth. Wooden supports held galleries, water wheels pumped out floods, and miners descended with picks and lamps. The work was dangerous. Collapses, gas, and flooding claimed lives. Yet the lure of wages drew thousands. Silver from Kutna Hora was minted into the Prague groschen, a coin so reliable and pure that it became one of Europe's most trusted currencies. Merchants carried it across trade routes from the Baltic to Italy. For Bohemian kings, silver filled treasuries, funded armies, built cathedrals, and paid for courts. For miners, it meant steady employment, but also exhaustion, injuries, and the ever-present fear of the mine's darkness. The town of Kutna Hora grew rapidly around the mines. Taverns filled with workers, markets bustled with traders, and churches rose to serve growing parishes. The great church of St. Barbara, patron saint of miners, was begun in the 14th century as a testament to both piety and prosperity. Its soaring Gothic arches were funded by the sweat of men who spent their lives underground. Prague, jewel of the kingdom. If Kutna Hora was the economic engine, Prague was the crown. The city expanded along the Vltava River, its castle dominating the hill above. Markets sprawled in Old Town, bridges linked neighborhoods, and new walls enclosed growing suburbs. Merchants' houses of stone replaced wooden cottages. By the 14th century, Prague was among the largest cities north of the Alps. Its most famous patron was Charles IV, 1346 to 1378, a ruler who elevated Bohemia to new heights. Educated in France, fluent in several languages, Charles brought vision to Prague. He founded Charles University in 1348, the first university in Central Europe, attracting scholars from across the continent. He began construction of St. Vitus Cathedral, whose Gothic spires still dominate the city today. He built Charles Bridge, lined with statues, linking both sides of the river. Prague under Charles IV was a city of students, merchants, priests, and craftsmen. Scholars debated theology and law in lecture halls. Guilds of butchers, bakers, and weavers regulated trades. Carpenters built houses, masons carved stone, and goldsmiths fashioned ornaments. Pilgrims visited relics in churches, and festivals filled streets with processions. It was a city alive with faith, commerce, and learning. Life in villages and monasteries beyond cities. Most Bohemians lived in villages, wooden cottages with thatched roofs clustered around churches. Fields of rye and oats stretched across cleared forests. Cabbage, peas, and onions filled gardens. Pigs roamed freely. Chickens scratched in yards, and cows provided milk. Life was communal. Peasants shared plowing teams, harvested together, and paid dues to lords. Obligations were heavy. Part of the harvest went to nobles or monasteries. Labor was required for roads and fortresses, and tithes were paid to churches. For many, survival depended on balancing meager harvests against dues. A poor harvest could mean hunger. Families dried beans, stored grain, and salted meat to endure winters. Children helped from an early age, tending animals or gathering firewood. Women spun wool, brewed ale, and cared for households. Life was hard, but the rhythms of seasons and the cycle of the church year gave it structure. Monasteries remained central. Benedictines, Cistercians, and Premonstratensians founded houses across Bohemia. They drained marshes, cleared forests, and taught new farming techniques. Monks copied manuscripts, preserving scripture and chronicles. Their bells marked time, and their cloisters offered education for elites. Pilgrims visited their relics, leaving coins and prayers for peasants. Monasteries were landlords but also sources of stability, places where famine relief might be given or disputes settled. Nobles and castles. The nobility of Bohemia lived in stone castles on hills, overseeing estates. Their power rested on controlling villages, collecting rents, and commanding knights. Their lives combined duty and privilege, hunting in forests, feasting in halls, and attending royal courts. Noble women managed households, arranged marriages, and oversaw servants. Castles were not only military strongholds, but also centers of administration, where scribes kept records and disputes were judged. Nobles owed loyalty to the king, but their support was essential. Kings relied on noble armies in war and noble cooperation in government. The balance between royal authority and noble privilege was delicate. Too much power for one weakened the other. In Bohemia, this balance was often held, contributing to stability compared to more fractured kingdoms, merchants, and trade. Trade gave Bohemia wider connections. Silver coins paid for cloth from Flanders, salt from Poland, and wine from the Rhineland. Merchants carried timber, grain, and beer to neighboring lands. Towns along routes flourished, with markets on weekly schedules and fairs at harvest time. Inns provided shelter for traders, while tolls at bridges and roads enriched lords. Guilds protected trades. Bakers ensured bread quality. Butchers regulated meat sales, and tailors enforced standards. Apprentices trained under masters, learning skills over the years before setting up shops. Markets bustled with foreign goods, spices, dyes, and sometimes silk. Though distant from the sea, Bohemia was never isolated. Faith and festivals, religion saturated daily life. The cult of St. Wenceslas gave Bohemia a patron whose image appeared on coins and in prayers. Parish churches marked time with bells, dawn, midday, and evening. Saints' days filled calendars with feasts, processions, and fairs. Easter brought decorated eggs, Pentecost saw greenery hung on doors, and Christmas filled churches with song. Festivals blended faith and community. After harvest, villages gathered for feasts of roasted meat, ale, and music. Minstrels sang tales, children played games, and adults danced in circles. Even in hard times, festivals offered respite, a reminder of joy amid toil. So by the 14th century, Bohemia stood as a kingdom of wealth and culture. Its silver paid for cathedrals and universities. Its capital, Prague, glittered as a jewel of Gothic architecture and scholarship. Its fields and villages sustained a stable population. Its kings were electors of emperors, giving them a voice in the empire. And yet, beneath this prosperity, strains existed. Nobles guarded their privileges. Religious movements stirred discontent. The very prosperity of Bohemia made it a target for others' ambitions. And so we pause with a question: can a kingdom built on silver and learning endure the weight of ambition? Or will prosperity itself invite the conflicts that unravel it? Prosperity often carries its own dangers. By the 14th and 15th centuries, the Kingdom of Bohemia had risen to prominence in Europe. Its silver-funded cathedrals, its king stood among the electors of emperors, and its capital, Prague, shone as a cultural center. But the very success that had made Bohemia the crown jewel of Central Europe also drew pressures from within and without. Nobles pressed for privileges, kings sought to strengthen authority, and religious tensions began to shake the foundations of the kingdom. The Golden Age of Charles IV, the reign of Charles IV, 1-3-6. 1378 marked Bohemia's peak. He was not only king of Bohemia, but also Holy Roman Emperor, making Prague the effective capital of the empire. Under his rule, Prague flourished, St. Vitus Cathedral rose, Charles University was founded, and bridges and walls expanded the city. Charles envisioned Prague as a new Rome, a spiritual and political center of Christendom for ordinary Bohemians. This meant opportunities and burdens. Builders, masons, and craftsmen found steady work in grand projects. Merchants thrived as Prague attracted scholars, clergy, and nobles. But taxes were heavy, demanded to fund construction and imperial obligations. Prosperity trickled unevenly. Peasants still labored in fields with wooden plows. Their lives little changed even as their king ruled half of Europe. Religious tensions. Yet beneath this golden age, religious discontent grew. The wealth of the church, the corruption of the clergy, and the inequalities between nobles and peasants stirred resentment. In Prague, preachers began to speak out. The most famous was Jan Hus, a reformer who called for a return to simplicity, denounced corruption, and demanded communion in both bread and wine for the laity. His sermons, preached in Czech rather than Latin, resonated deeply with ordinary people. Hus was condemned as a heretic and burned at the stake in 1415. His death ignited fury in Bohemia. Nobles, peasants, and townsfolk rallied to his cause, sparking the Hussite Wars 1419 to 1434. These wars were not only about religion, but also about national identity and class struggle. Armies of peasants and townsmen, armed with wagons and pikes, defeated crusades sent against them by the Pope and Emperor for decades. Bohemia became a battlefield of faith, its unity fractured, its reputation transformed from crown jewel to rebel land. For villagers and townsfolk, the wars meant upheaval. Fields lay fallow, towns were burned, and families fled violence. Yet the Hussite armies also drew strength from ordinary people, who fought not for conquest, but for survival and faith in their hymns and banners. One hears the voice of peasants demanding dignity. In a world that often denied it, dynastic changes after the Hussite turmoil, Bohemia entered a new phase. The Premysl dynasty, which had ruled since the early Middle Ages, had already ended in 1306. Successive dynasties, the Luxembourgs, the Jagiellonians, and finally the Habsburgs, held the Bohemian crown. With each shift, Bohemia became more entangled in the politics of Europe. Under the Luxembourgs, Bohemia reached imperial prominence. Under the Jagiellonians, it was tied to Poland and Hungary. Under the Habsburgs, beginning in the 16th century, it became part of a vast empire stretching across Europe. The Bohemian crown remained prestigious. The local autonomy weakened. Kings ruled from Vienna rather than Prague, and decisions that once centered in Bohemia were now made in imperial councils. Daily life in later centuries for ordinary people. These dynastic changes were distant matters. Their lives remained tied to soil and seasons. Peasants continued to plant rye and barley, to herd pigs and cattle, to brew beer and bake bread. Nobles expanded their estates, building Renaissance palaces alongside medieval castles. Monasteries survived. Though some declined after the Reformation, towns continued to trade. Though war and plague often disrupted commerce, the memory of Jan Hus and the Hussites lingered, shaping Bohemian identity long after the wars ended. Villagers sang hymns recalling their struggle, while nobles guarded privileges won. During the upheaval, even under foreign dynasties, a sense of distinctiveness remained. The idea that Bohemia was not merely another province, but a land with its own saints, its own martyrs, its own voice. The jewel fades by the early modern era. Bohemia's role as a crown jewel had dimmed. The discovery of new silver mines elsewhere, the rise of larger nation-states, and the centralization of the Habsburg Empire reduced its independence. Prague remained a beautiful city, its Gothic spires still piercing the sky, but it no longer served as the capital of an empire. Bohemia became a valuable province rather than a sovereign power, and yet its legacy endured. The Prague groschen remained a memory of economic might. The university and cathedral stood as monuments to learning and faith. The Hussite legacy shaped Protestant thought across Europe, and the very word Bohemian carried echoes of independence, nonconformity, and cultural richness, though in later centuries, it would be transformed into something entirely different, a kingdom remembered today. To walk through Prague is to see layers of this history. The stone bridge of Charles IV still arches over the Vltava, lined with statues. The towers of St. Vitus still rise above the castle hill. The winding streets of Old Town still echo with merchant stalls and students' voices. And beneath it all, the memory of a kingdom that once shone brightly, then struggled, then faded, lingers. The kingdom of Bohemia was not forgotten because it failed, but because it was absorbed. Its brilliance as a crown jewel was real, but it belonged to a time, when kingdoms rose and fell quickly, when prosperity was fragile, and when faith could ignite wars. And so we end with a question. Is the true jewel of history the brilliance of a golden age, or the endurance of a people who carry memory forward even after crowns and kings are gone? The history of Bosnia is often overshadowed by its larger neighbors, Hungary to the north, Serbia to the east, and Croatia to the west. Yet in the Middle Ages, Bosnia was not merely a land caught between powers. For a brief but remarkable period, it was its own kingdom, independent and distinct, though fragile. Today, Bosnia is often remembered for later centuries of Ottoman and Habsburg rule. But before those empires, there was a time when kings sat in Bosnia, and when its valleys carried their own voice and Europe's crowded chorus. Geography of a borderland. Bosnia's geography has always defined it: rugged mountains, deep valleys, and rivers like the Bosna, Drina, and Neretva shape settlement and survival. Unlike the fertile plains of Hungary or the wide fields of France, Bosnia offered difficult terrain. Fields were small, carved out of valleys. Travel was slow. Passes were hard to cross, and winters were long. But geography gave protection as well. Armies that could sweep across plains struggled in Bosnia's forests and ridges for centuries. Bosnia endured not by wealth, but by resilience in its mountain strongholds. Early origins in the early Middle Ages. Slavic tribes settled the land, blending with remnants of Roman and Illyrian populations. By the 9th century, Bosnia was loosely under the influence of larger states, sometimes the Byzantine Empire, sometimes Croatia, sometimes Serbia. Yet the mountains limited control. Local chieftains and clans ruled valleys with relative independence. Over time, this fostered a culture distinct from neighbors, neither fully Eastern Orthodox like Serbia, nor fully Catholic like Croatia, but something in between. The Banat of Bosnia. By the 12th century, Bosnia began to coalesce under local rulers called bands. The most famous of the early bands was Ban, 1180 to 1204, who is often remembered as a founder figure. Strengthened autonomy from Hungary, secured trade with Dubrovnik, and gave Bosnia stability. A famous charter issued in 1189, written in Bosnian Cyrillic, granted privileges to merchants of Dubrovnik, showing Bosnia's role in connecting inland trade with the Adriatic coast. Bosnia was not rich, but it was resilient. Villages dotted valleys, where peasants grew barley, millet, and beans. Sheep and goats grazed on hillsides, providing wool and cheese. Forests gave timber and game. Life was modest but sustainable. Merchants carried hides, wool, and timber down to Dalmatian ports, bringing back salt, cloth, and wine. Bosnia was never a great trading hub like Venice, but it quietly linked interior lands with the sea. Religion and identity. What made Bosnia unusual was its religious landscape. While neighboring kingdoms were firmly Catholic or Orthodox, Bosnia had a mixed identity. Catholic missionaries worked from the west, Orthodox clergy from the east. But in Bosnia itself, a distinctive local Christian community developed, often called the Bosnian Church. Its exact beliefs remain debated, but it was regarded as heretical by both Rome and Constantinople. This ambiguous faith gave Bosnia a reputation as a land of heresy. Though for ordinary people it likely meant simpler practices, worship in small churches, less ornate rituals, and leadership by local elders rather than distant bishops. This religious ambiguity was both a strength and a weakness. It set Bosnia apart, giving it independence from outside churches. But it also gave neighbors excuses to intervene, claiming to correct Bosnia's faith. For Bosnians themselves, however, religion was less about politics than about daily rhythms: baptisms, burials, prayers for harvests, and faith in a God who guided them through harsh winters. Everyday life for peasants. Life in Bosnia was marked by toil. Fields were small, tools simple, and yields uncertain. Houses were built of wood and stone, with thatched roofs and single rooms where families and animals shared space in winter. Meals were coarse bread, stews of beans, and cheese from goats or sheep. Meat was rare except during feasts, Woolen clothing kept out mountain cold and was dyed with simple colors from plants. Despite hardship, communities found joy in festivals. Weddings brought villages together with music, dancing, and feasting. Harvest celebrations offered relief after months of labor. Folklore, songs, and epic tales were shared around fires, even in isolation. Bosnian valleys were filled with traditions that gave meaning and continuity. Caught between powers, even as Bosnia grew under its bans, it remained vulnerable. Hungary claimed overlordship, demanding tribute. The Byzantine Empire, and later Serbia, sought influence. Yet Bosnia's mountains shielded it. Armies could invade, but holding territory was harder. Local lords retreated into fortresses, peasants melted into forests, and invaders soon found supply lines stretched thin. In this way, Bosnia preserved autonomy. By the late 12th and early 13th centuries, Bosnia had a reputation as independent, stubborn, and difficult to control. It was a borderland kingdom in the making, defined less by wealth than by endurance. And so we pause with a question: can a land whose strength lies not in riches or armies, but in mountains, faith, and persistence, endure as a kingdom when surrounded by greater powers? The Banat of Bosnia, forged in the time of Ban Kulin, was only the beginning. By the 14th century, Bosnia moved from being a buffer land ruled by bans to becoming a kingdom in its own right. The transformation was gradual, shaped by resourceful rulers, resilient people, and the peculiar position of Bosnia as a place both connected to and separate from the great powers around it. From ban to king. After Kulin's long and stable reign, Bosnia faced constant pressure from Hungary. Hungarian kings claimed suzerainty, insisting that Bosnia was part of their sphere of influence. Yet Bosnia's mountainous terrain and decentralized society gave its rulers surprising independence in the 14th century. Under leaders like Ban St. Jepan II Kotromanic, Bosnia expanded its influence into neighboring lands, even gaining access to the Adriatic coast. The true elevation came under Tvrtko IR, 1353 to 1391, the greatest of Bosnia's rulers. In 1377, Tvrtko crowned himself King of Bosnia, adopting not only the title, but also the ambition of broader rule. He claimed descent from the Serbian royal house through his grandmother and styled himself King of Serbs, Bosnia, and parts of Dalmatia. For a time, Bosnia under Tvrtko was not just a mountain refuge, but a regional power stretching from the Adriatic to the Sava. Tvrtko's reign brought relative stability and prosperity. He minted coins, strengthened administration, and fostered trade with coastal cities like Dubrovnik. His court hosted scribes, envoys, and knights. Bosnia's mountains, once seen only as barriers, became sources of wealth, forests for timber, pastures for flocks, and especially mines of silver and iron that supplied European markets. Like Bohemia, Bosnia discovered that silver could lift it from obscurity into influence. Mining and trade. Bosnian mines, particularly in central regions like Srebrenica, became crucial. Miners, many of them Saxon settlers from Germany, dug deep into hills, extracting ore that was smelted and minted into coins. This silver flowed through markets in Dubrovnik and beyond, connecting Bosnia to Mediterranean trade. Iron ore fueled weapons and tools. Timber from forests built ships and supplied construction. For merchants in coastal cities, Bosnia was a vital hinterland. Villages near mines thrived, filled with workers, traders, and inns. Markets bustled with sacks of ore, bowls of cloth, barrels of wine, and salted fish from the Adriatic. Dubrovnik's merchants, skilled in diplomacy, forged treaties with Bosnian rulers to secure trade privileges. Through these networks, Bosnia, though landlocked in much of its core, became part of the wider economy of the Mediterranean. Life in the villages. Despite mining wealth, most Bosnians lived in small villages scattered across valleys. Fields of barley, millet, and oats sustained families. Sheep and goats grazed on hills. Their wool spun into clothing. Honey remained a key sweetener, while forests supplied nuts, berries, and game. Life was communal. Neighbors helped in plowing and harvest. Families shared tools, and survival often depended on cooperation. Houses were simple, built of timber or stone, with single rooms and smoke-blackened rafters. Winter brought families and animals together under one roof for warmth. Meals were coarse but sustaining: bread, cheese, beans, and on feast days, roasted lamb or pig. Work was hard, but festivals lightened the burden. Weddings, often arranged but celebrated with joy, brought music, dancing, and feasting. Harvest festivals filled valleys with songs. These moments gave color to lives otherwise bound by toil. Faith in a divided land. Religion remained complex in Bosnia. The Catholic Church in Rome claimed Bosnia as its flock, and Hungarian rulers often used accusations of heresy as justification for intervention. Orthodox influence also seeped in from Serbia, but the Bosnian Church, with its own clergy and practices, persisted. Its leaders were called grandfathers and Christians, emphasizing simplicity. Their liturgy avoided some of the pomp of Catholicism or Orthodoxy. For peasants, the distinctions mattered little in daily prayer. They baptized children, married in simple rites, prayed for good harvests, and buried their dead with wooden crosses or stone markers. But for politics, Bosnia's religious distinctiveness was both shield and target. Shield, because it gave Bosnians an identity separate from neighbors. Target, because Rome and Hungary saw it as heresy, a reason to demand intervention. Castles and nobles. Bosnia's lords built stone castles on ridges, overlooking valleys and trade routes. These fortresses, though smaller than those of France or England, were strongholds of power. Lords controlled villages, collected rents, and fielded small retinues of knights. Loyalty to the king was often tenuous. Bosnia remained a patchwork of semi-independent nobles, yet under strong rulers. Like Tvrtko, these nobles could be bound together for common goals. Life in castles contrasted sharply with village existence. Lords dined on roasted meats, honeyed wine, and imported delicacies from the coast. Their halls echoed with minstrels and the clatter of feasts. Noble women managed households, oversaw weaving, and arranged alliances through marriage. Yet even nobles faced constant insecurity, shifting alliances, raids from neighbors, and the challenge of keeping peasants loyal in difficult terrain. Struggles with Hungary and the Church. Hungary never relinquished its claim to Bosnia. Time and again, Hungarian kings sought to reassert control, often with papal blessing to correct heresy. Crusades were sometimes preached against Bosnia's church, though they rarely succeeded in conquering the land. Bosnia's mountains and decentralized society made it difficult to subdue. Still, the constant pressure meant Bosnian rulers had to walk carefully, sometimes allying with Hungary, sometimes defying it, always guarding autonomy. The Catholic Church established dioceses and monasteries in Bosnia, but conversions were uneven. Franciscan friars became especially active in the 14th century, preaching among villages, setting up friaries, and gradually drawing many Bosnians closer to Catholicism. Yet the Bosnian Church persisted, its simplicity continuing to appeal to local communities. A kingdom of tension and balance. By the time of Tvrtko's reign, Bosnia had achieved something rare: independence and recognition as a kingdom. Yet it was a fragile independence, always threatened by Hungary, Serbia, or the Church. Bosnia endured not by overpowering enemies, but by maneuvering between them, using mountains as shields and trade as leverage. And so in this middle chapter, Bosnia stands at its height, a land of silver mines and shepherd villages, of kings and courts and peasants and valleys, of a church both condemned and cherished. Its story is one of balance between empires, between faiths, and between survival and ambition. And so we pause with a question: can a kingdom built on balance between stronger powers endure? Or must it eventually be consumed by the very empires it defies? Every middle kingdom that lives between empires eventually faces the same test. Can it hold its balance when the weight of larger powers grows too great? For Bosnia, the 15th century was the test. For more than 200 years, it had endured a mountain land of silver mines, resilient peasants, and rulers who called themselves kings. But the forces around it were changing. Hungary grew more insistent in its claims. The church pressed harder for conformity, and a new power, the Ottoman Empire, advanced steadily through the Balkans. The waning of strength after the reign of Tverkoi, Bosnia's golden age dimmed. The Koch-Romanic dynasty continued to rule, but their authority weakened as nobles gained strength. The kingdom's geography, once its shield, now encouraged fragmentation. Powerful lords like the Hrvatinic, Pavlovic, and Kosaka families controlled their own territories, castles, and armies. The king in Bobovac or Jaish ruled in name, but real power was dispersed. When Bosnia was united, it could resist its neighbors. Divided, it became vulnerable. Mining still enriched Bosnia, but silver veins declined and foreign markets shifted. Trade with Dubrovnik continued, but constant raids and instability disrupted the flow. Villages carried on, as they always had, sowing rye, tending flocks, praying in stone churches, but the wider structures that held the kingdom together began to crack. Religious pressures. Religion, long Bosnia's distinctive mark, became a source of vulnerability. The Bosnian Church, tolerated for centuries, came under increasing attack. Papal bulls condemned it, branding its followers heretics. Hungary used this as justification for interference, launching campaigns under the banner of crusade. Franciscan friars expanded their presence, building monasteries and converting communities to Catholicism. By the mid-15th century, Bosnia's religious landscape was deeply divided, Catholics in some valleys, Orthodox in others, and the Bosnian church still surviving in pockets. For rulers, this made unity harder. For neighbors, it offered pretexts for intervention. Bosnia's strength, its independence of faith, had become a weakness in a Europe demanding conformity. The Ottoman advance, meanwhile, a new power moved relentlessly closer. The Ottoman Empire, having defeated Serbia at the Battle of Kosovo in 1389, advanced steadily through the Balkans. By the early 15th century, Ottoman armies raided Bosnian lands, demanding tribute. Some Bosnian nobles allied with them, seeing the Ottomans as protection against Hungary. Others resisted, calling for aid from the Pope or Venice. For peasants, Ottoman raids meant burned villages, lost harvests, and forced tribute. Families fled into forests, castles filled with refugees, and markets faltered. Yet for some, Ottoman presence also offered opportunities: stability under a strong empire, escape from noble burdens, and a chance for advancement in a new order. The Ottomans were feared, but they were also a reality that Bosnia could not ignore. The fall of the kingdom, the decisive moment, came in 1463. Sultan Mehmed II, conqueror of Constantinople, turned his armies toward Bosnia. The kingdom, divided among nobles and weakened by years of internal strife, could not withstand the assault. Castles fell one by one, towns surrendered, and King Saint Jepan Tomasevic, the last king of Bosnia, was captured and executed. The independent kingdom of Bosnia was no more. Some resistance continued in mountain fortresses, and for a brief time, Hungary tried to reassert control over northern Bosnia. But the Ottomans, with their disciplined armies and administrative systems, absorbed the land into their empire. By the end of the 15th century, Bosnia was firmly Ottoman. Life after the kingdom for ordinary Bosnians. The end of the kingdom meant change, but also continuity. Fields were still plowed, flocks still grazed, and families still gathered for weddings and feasts. But taxes were now paid to Ottoman officials, sometimes in coin, sometimes in kind. Some Christian families saw sons taken through the Devirum, the levy of boys who became janissaries. Over time, Islam spread, especially in towns, where conversion brought privileges. Villages adjusted, parish churches continued, Franciscan friars remained active, and Orthodox monasteries survived. But minarets rose beside bell towers, and Ottoman law replaced royal decrees. Bosnia remained a land between faiths and empires, as it had always been, only now the empire was Ottoman, not Hungarian or Byzantine. Memory of the kingdom. The memory of the medieval Bosnian kingdom did not vanish, though it faded. Chronicles remember Ban Kulin as a just ruler, Tvrko as a great king, and the Bosnian church as a symbol of independence. Ruins of castles like Bobovac and Jai stood as reminders of a time when Bosnia had kings. Villagers told stories of lost crowns and betrayed rulers, blending history with legend. For centuries afterward, Bosnia was defined by being part of others' empires. Yet the brief life of its kingdom remained a touchstone of time, when Bosnia was not only a land in between, but a realm of its own. A reflection, the kingdom of Bosnia was never vast, never rich compared to its neighbors, and never entirely secure. Yet for nearly 2 centuries it endured, balancing between Hungary and Serbia, the church and its own faith, Christians, and eventually the Ottomans. Its story is one of resilience in difficult terrain, of miners digging silver in mountain shafts, of peasants tending flocks in valleys, of lords building castles on ridges, and of kings briefly holding crowns in courts of stone. And so we end with a thought. Bosnia's kingdom may be forgotten in many histories, but perhaps its lesson lies in survival, not in glory, in a world of empires. It stood for a time on its own, between faiths, between powers, and between mountains, and perhaps that is enough. When people today think of medieval kingdoms, they often imagine France, England, or the Holy Roman Empire. Few would name Lithuania. And yet, for a time in the Middle Ages, Lithuania was the largest state in Europe, stretching from the Baltic Sea deep into the lands of modern Ukraine and Belarus, rivaling empires far larger and older. It began not as a mighty Christian realm, but as a pagan stronghold, a collection of tribes clinging to forests and rivers, that somehow grew into a kingdom and then a grand duchy, whose name echoed across the continent. Geography and beginnings. Lithuania's heart lay in the flat plains and thick forests along the Niemen River. The land was both fertile and forbidding. Wide rivers and marshes offered natural defenses, while dense forests gave cover to hunters and warriors alike. Winters were long and cold, summers short but fertile, and life was bound to cycles of grain sowing, animal herding, and fishing. Unlike the fertile valleys of France or Italy, Lithuania's wealth lay in its resilience, its ability to endure in harsh conditions. In the early Middle Ages, the land was home to Baltic tribes, not Slavs, not Germans, but a people with their own language, customs, and gods. Their villages clustered around wooden hill forts, defended by palisades. Their faith was pagan, rooted in sacred groves, fire rituals, and reverence for deities of sun, thunder, and fertility. Priests tended eternal flames, offerings were left at springs and trees, and communities bound themselves to traditions older than Rome or Byzantium for centuries. These tribes were little known to the wider world. Chronicles of Germans and Poles mention them mainly as raiders or pagans resisting conversion. Yet isolation also preserved their independence, while Poland and Rus fell under Christianity. While Germans advanced eastward with crusading wars, Lithuania's tribes remained stubbornly pagan, united not by empire, but by shared resistance. The rise of Mindaugas. The turning point came in the 13th century under a chieftain named Mindaugas. Through alliances, warfare, and diplomacy, he brought rival clans under his authority. In 1253, he accepted baptism and was crowned king of Lithuania, recognized by the Pope. For a brief moment, Lithuania stood as a Christian kingdom. Yet Mindaugas' motives were practical. Baptism secured papal recognition and peace with crusading knights, but his power still rested on pagan warriors and tribal loyalties. After his assassination in 1263, Lithuania returned to its old faith, and the crown lapsed. Still, Mindaugas had shown what was possible, that Lithuania could be more than scattered tribes, that it could be a state. His successors, known as Grand Dukes, built on his foundations. They resisted the Teutonic Knights to the west, pushed eastward into Rus lands, and forged a realm that stretched across rivers and forests farther than anyone had expected. Life in pagan Lithuania. Daily life in early Lithuania was simple but demanding. Villages consisted of wooden houses thatched with reeds, smoke seeping through holes in the roof. Families raised barley, rye, and oats. Cows, pigs, and chickens provided milk, meat, and eggs. Honey was a vital sweetener, gathered from forest hives. Hunting supplied deer, elk, and boar. Fishing filled nets from rivers and lakes. Seasons ruled existence. Spring brought planting, summer brought herding and haymaking. Autumn brought harvests and hunting, and winter brought long nights by hearths. Repairing tools and telling stories, communities were close-knit. Survival depending on cooperation. Religion infused daily life. Sacred groves were left untouched. Fires burned on altars, and offerings of food or animals were made to gods. Priests and priestesses guarded rituals. But faith was communal. People believed in spirits of forests, rivers, and ancestors. Festivals celebrated solstices and harvests with songs, dances, and feasting. To neighboring Christians, these practices looked like stubborn paganism. To Lithuanians, they were the fabric of identity. Warriors and hill forts. Lithuania's strength lay in its warriors. Young men trained with bows, spears, and axes. Hardened by hunting and raids, hill forts provided defense. Wooden walls on earthen mounds, with villages clustered below. In times of danger, families fled into the forts, while warriors defended palisades. Battles were swift, relying on ambushes in forests and raids across rivers. The threat of the Teutonic Knights, German crusaders determined to Christianize the Baltic shaped Lithuania's growth. For centuries, the Knights waged war, building castles, raiding villages, and demanding conversion. Lithuanians responded with resilience, burning castles, ambushing columns, and retreating into forests when pressed. This constant pressure forced unity. What had been scattered tribes became a confederation under dukes, for only by standing together could they resist. Trade and contact. Despite wars, Lithuania was not isolated. Amber from the Baltic was prized across Europe, carried by merchants to Germany and beyond. Furs, wax, and honey were exported. Salt, cloth, and metal were imported. Lithuanian envoys negotiated with Poles, Russians, and Germans, though often described as outsiders. Lithuanians were already part of Europe's networks, just not on Europe's terms. So by the late 13th century, Lithuania was more than a collection of tribes. It was a rising state, forged by geography, hardened by war, sustained by forests and rivers, and defined by its unique balance of pagan tradition and pragmatic diplomacy. And so we pause with a question. Could a kingdom that clung to its old gods in a continent, turning Christian, find a way to survive, or would it be forced to choose between faith and survival? By the early 14th century, Lithuania was no longer a hidden corner of Europe. What had begun as scattered tribes defending sacred groves and hill forts had become the Grand Duchy of Lithuania, a state that surprised its neighbors by not only surviving, but also expanding. While much of Europe looked westward, toward France, England, or the Mediterranean, Lithuania looked east. Its rulers seized opportunity where others saw wilderness, forests, rivers, and the collapse of old powers gave Lithuania space to grow. And grow it did until it stretched across lands larger than any kingdom in Europe. Expansion. Eastward, the collapse of Kievan Rus after Mongol invasions in the 13th century left much of Eastern Europe fractured. Principalities in modern Ukraine and Belarus lay weakened, their people taxed by Mongol overlords. Into this vacuum stepped Lithuania, its Grand Dukes most, notably Gediminas, or 1316 to 1341, extended influence over vast territories. They captured towns, built alliances, and offered protection from Mongol raids. By mid-century, Lithuania's reach extended from the Baltic Sea south to the Black Sea. It encompassed not only Lithuanians but also large populations of Slavs, Orthodox Christians, with traditions, very different from their pagan overlords. This diversity became both a strength and a challenge. Lithuania was no longer a small pagan refuge. It was a multi-ethnic, multi-faith empire, pagan dukes and Christian subjects. Lithuania's rulers remained officially pagan longer than any other major European dynasty, while Poles, Hungarians, and Scandinavians had accepted Christianity centuries earlier. Lithuania's dukes still offered sacrifices in sacred groves and lit eternal fires for their gods. Yet they governed millions of Orthodox Christians and traded with Catholic neighbors. This created a unique duality: pagan Grand Dukes issuing charters in Latin, Orthodox clergy administering towns, and Catholic envoys negotiating treaties. Gediminas himself was a master of this balance. He invited German merchants and craftsmen to settle in Vilnius, his capital, offering them privileges. He corresponded with the Pope, hinting at possible conversion, while at the same time assuring his people that pagan traditions would not be abandoned. This ambiguity bought time. Lithuania remained officially pagan, but it also integrated Christians into its administration, giving bishops lands and protecting Orthodox rites. Everyday life in a vast duchy, the Grand Duchy's sheer size meant that life varied widely. In Lithuanian heartlands, villages remained much as they had in earlier centuries: wooden houses with thatched roofs, fields of rye and barley, and sacred groves where rituals honored gods of thunder and sun. Communities gathered for feasts, at midsummer sang folk songs, and hunted in deep forests in the Slavic lands to the south and east. Life followed Orthodox Christian rhythms. Towns like Kiev and Smolensk had stone churches with onion domes, markets with Slavic merchants, and chronicles written by monks. Villagers farmed wheat, raised cattle, and followed the church calendar of fasts and feasts for them. Lithuanian rule meant new overlords, but little change in daily labor. Taxes were collected, soldiers were recruited, but faith and customs endured. Merchants found opportunity in Lithuania's expansion. Trade routes linked the Baltic with the Black Sea, carrying furs, wax, and honey north, and salt, wine, and cloth south. German merchants from Riga met Greek traders from the Black Sea, their goods crossing Lithuanian lands. Toll stations along rivers and rich dukes, while inns and markets sustained locals. Vilnius, a new capital. The capital of Lithuania shifted to Vilnius, chosen for its defensible position at the confluence of rivers and its centrality in the growing state. Wooden fortifications rose on hills. Markets filled the lower town, and farm merchants settled under ducal protection. Pagan temples stood beside Christian churches. For travelers, Vilnius was a paradox, a pagan court that issued documents in Latin, a city where German artisans worked stone while local priests guarded sacred fires. The Teutonic Knights, a constant threat while Lithuania expanded east. To the west, it faced relentless war with the Teutonic Knights. These crusading knights, based in Prussia, were dedicated to Christianizing the last pagan stronghold in Europe. For centuries, they raided Lithuanian villages, burned crops, and built castles along the frontier. Lithuanian warriors responded with counter-raids, ambushing knights in forests and burning fortresses when possible. For villagers in borderlands, this meant constant insecurity. A harvest might be destroyed by raiders, families taken captive, and homes reduced to ash. Yet it also hardened Lithuania's society. Hill forts multiplied, warriors trained from youth, and a culture of resilience developed. Songs and tales celebrated raids, ambushes, and the defense of sacred groves. Religion as strategy. By the mid-14th century, Lithuania's rulers began to see that survival required more than strength. Conversion to Christianity, long resisted, could be a tool. Some Grand Dukes, like Algirdas, married Orthodox princesses, tying themselves to Rus dynasties. Others hinted at conversion to Catholicism to secure peace with Poland and the papacy. For decades, Lithuania balanced carefully pagan in ritual, Christian in politics. For ordinary people, these debates mattered less than survival. Pagan villagers still lit fires in groves, Orthodox peasants still fasted and feasted by church calendars, and Catholic merchants still crossed markets in Lithuania, unlike elsewhere. Faith was plural, layered, and pragmatic, a giant in Europe by the late 14th century. Lithuania covered lands from the Baltic to the Black Sea more than any other European state of its time. It was not a kingdom of monumental cathedrals or centralized administration, but a patchwork empire held together by diplomacy, marriage, and the strength of its dukes. Its resilience came not from uniformity, but from flexibility, and yet, questions loom. How long could a pagan dynasty rule in a Christian continent? Could a patchwork of Lithuanians, Slavs, and Germans hold together? Would alliances with Poland and marriage ties to Catholic dynasties reshape Lithuania's future? And so we pause with a question: is survival best achieved by holding firmly to one's own traditions or by bending to the pressures of the world beyond? By the late 14th century, Lithuania faced a crossroads. It had grown into the largest state in Europe, stretching across forests and plains from the Baltic Sea to the Black Sea. Yet it remained a pagan stronghold, ruled by dukes who still lit fires in sacred groves, while every neighbor around it followed Christianity. The pressure to change grew stronger. The Teutonic Knights continued their crusades. Hungary eyed its borders, and Poland offered alliance in exchange for conversion. For Lithuania, the choice was start, remain pagan, and fight endlessly, or accept baptism and step into Europe's Christian order. The conversion of Jogaila the decisive moment came with Jogaila, later Władysław II Yagu, Grand Duke of Lithuania. In 1386, he married Queen Jadwiga of Poland, agreeing to convert to Christianity. Baptized as Władysław, he became king of Poland while retaining power over Lithuania. This union, known as the Polish-Lithuanian Union, transformed the region. Lithuania became officially Catholic, ending the justification for Teutonic crusades. The two realms together formed one of the largest and most powerful alliances in Europe. For ordinary Lithuanians, conversion was less dramatic than chronicles suggest. Pagan rituals were slowly replaced by Catholic sacraments. Wooden shrines were pulled down, and churches were built in their place. Priests baptized villagers by the hundreds, teaching them prayers in Latin and Polish. Yet many old practices lingered quietly. Midsummer bonfires, reverence for sacred groves, and folk songs that carried echoes of the old gods. Faith shifted, but culture endured. The Battle of Grunwald, the new Catholic identity, was soon tested. In 1410, the combined Polish-Lithuanian army faced the Teutonic Knights at the Battle of Grunwald or Tannenberg. It was one of the largest battles of medieval Europe. Knights in heavy armor clashed with Lithuanian cavalry and Polish banners. By day's end, the Teutonic Order was crushed, its myth of invincibility broken. For Lithuania, Grunwald symbolized vindication, no longer outsiders or pagans. They had defeated the Crusaders who had tormented them for centuries. The victory secured Lithuania's survival as part of the European order, life in the Union. The union with Poland brought both opportunity and tension. Lithuanian nobles gained new privileges, and Catholicism spread rapidly. Towns grew, especially Vilnius, Kaunas, and Trakai, now dotted with churches, castles, and merchant guilds. Latin and Polish joined Lithuanian and Ruthenian as languages of law and administration. Orthodox populations in the east continued their traditions, adding to the kingdom's diversity. Villages still lived by the old rhythms, sowing rye, herding cattle, fishing rivers, and gathering honey. Markets expanded, with German, Polish, and Ruthenian merchants trading in towns. Nobles hunted in vast forests, while peasants paid dues in grain, wool, or labor. The differences between the pagan past and the Catholic present blurred in daily life. A villager might attend Mass in the morning and light a bonfire at midsummer, as his ancestors had done for centuries. Lithuania is Europe's giant at its height in the 15th century. The Grand Duchy of Lithuania covered lands stretching into modern Ukraine, Belarus, Latvia, and Russia. Its rulers controlled Kiev, Smolensk, and vast steppes. It was less centralized than France or England, more a federation of lands under the Grand Duke. Orthodox princes governed eastern towns. Catholic nobles ruled Lithuanian cores, and the balance helped because it offered protection against greater threats. The union with Poland strengthened this federation. Together, they became a bulwark against the Teutonic Order, the Mongol successor states, and later the rising power of Muscovy. The Lithuanian cavalry, famed for its speed, rode alongside Polish knights in campaigns. Diplomats from Lithuania sat at European courts. What had once been dismissed as a pagan backwater was now a major player. Decline and transformation. Yet size brought challenges. Governing such vast and diverse lands strained administration. Orthodox nobles in the east sometimes resented Catholic dominance. Muscovy grew stronger, challenging Lithuanian control over Rus territories. By the 16th century, pressures mounted. In 1569, the Union of Lublin formally merged Poland and Lithuania into a single state, the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. Lithuania retained its identity, but lost much independence. For villagers, these political changes were distant. They still plowed fields, brewed beer, wove cloth, and marked the year with festivals. But taxes grew heavier, nobles gained more power, and wars more frequently disturbed their lands. Lithuania's glory as Europe's giant faded, but its memory of independence lingered. Legacy of Lithuania's kingdom. What makes Lithuania's story remarkable is not only its size, but also its uniqueness. It was the last pagan state in Europe, resisting conversion for centuries. It grew not by crusade or inheritance, but by resilience, diplomacy, and expansion into lands others had abandoned for a time. It rivaled the greatest kingdoms of Europe, yet today its story is often overlooked. To walk in Vilnius today is to see remnants of this era. The castle hill still overlooks the city. Churches built on the ruins of pagan shrines still stand. Streets that once echoed with merchants from Riga, Kiev, and Krakow still bustle. In folk songs, midsummer fires, and the Lithuanian language itself, one of the most ancient in Europe, the memory of the pagan stronghold turned giant survives. A reflection. The kingdom and Grand Duchy of Lithuania remind us that history is not always made by those who begin strong. Sometimes it is the overlooked, the stubborn, and the outsiders who rise. Lithuania, from its hill forts and sacred groves, built an empire that stretched farther than any in its time. It bent to Christianity when it had to, but only after securing survival on its own terms. And so we end with a question. Is true strength found in holding to one's traditions, as long as possible, or in knowing when to change them for the sake of endurance? Lithuania did both, and for a moment, it became Europe's forgotten giant.